All right, guys, it's Mrs. Klein.
And Mrs. Wilbren. In our last podcast, you heard about the Boston Tea Party, and now we're going to talk about the consequences of that.
Definitely.
The consequences being the intolerable acts. The news of the Boston Tea Party stunned Lord North, who believed that he had helped the colonists by sending them cheap tea. However, instead of being thankful for his generosity, the colonists had thrown the cheap tea into the sea. For North, the colonists' actions had gone too far. In 1774, Great Britain's anger led Parliament to pass a new series of laws that were so harsh that many colonists called them intolerable or unacceptable. Throughout the colonies, they became known as the Intolerable Acts.
Okay, you guys, so the Boston Tea Party takes place in Boston, and so Massachusetts has the big gigantic target on its back, okay, all right, and the British are coming for them. So Parliament punishes Massachusetts. The Intolerable Acts were designed to punish Massachusetts for the Boston Tea Party. You guys, they did things like block the harbor. They made it difficult for things to get in and out. They were shutting down the city, and people were starving, and it was not an easy time for them. And there were some people in the colonies who were saying, all right, Massachusetts, you're on your own, all right? But then eventually the tide starts to turn a little bit, and there's other colonies who are willing to step up and help.
Yes. Okay.
All right. So the colonies began to unite. So in fact, the Intolerable Acts did not force the colonists to give in like the British were hoping. In Virginia, lawmakers drafted a resolution in support of Massachusetts. Mm-hmm. And the Virginians also called for a Congress or meeting of delegates from all the colonies. The purpose of the Congress would be to find a peaceful solution to the conflicts of Great Britain.
Okay. So the colonies come together in what is called the First Continental Congress. In September 1774, some 50 leaders from 12 colonies. Do you remember the colony? Was it Georgia that didn't come?
I think it was Georgia.
It was Georgia. Okay, so all of the colonies except for Georgia came to the First Continental Congress. So let me start again here. In September 1774, some 50 leaders from 12 colonies met in Philadelphia. The meeting brought together delegates from most of the British colonies on the North American continent, so it was called the First Continental Congress. Now, in spite of their differences, the delegates agreed to send a respectful message to King George. The message urged the king to consider their complaints and to recognize their rights, because again, they are British citizens. The delegates also called for a new boycott of British goods until Parliament repealed the Intolerable Acts.
The colonies now start to form militias. So patriots in towns and cities throughout the colonies organized boycotts against British goods, and they also formed local militias in case the boycott didn't work. And remember, you guys, there's British soldiers who are here in the United States. Well, was not the United States yet, in America, right. I should say, in America. All right. This leads us to Lexington and Concord. King George had made many mistakes in his decisions about the colonies, which the First Continental Congress listed out in their message to the king. However, rather than consider the colonists' complaints, King George refused to even answer their message.
Yes.
Okay, all right. Totally snubs them. Not even going to bother talking to you or responding to this.
Exactly. So we're going to talk about the first blow at Lexington. In April 1775, a spy told General Gage that the colonists were hiding a large supply of gunpowder and weapons in the nearby village of Concord. General Gage decided to strike at once, but the colonists had their own spies. And when Gage's troops slipped out of Boston on April 18, 1775, patriots were watching their every move. Soon, Paul Revere and others were galloping through the countryside, warning colonists that the British soldiers were coming. As the Minutemen faced the British troops, a shot rang out. From where? No one was certain. When the firing stopped, 8 colonists lay dead or dying. The British troops gave 3 cheers for victory and continued their march to Concord.
All right, so one blow, and now here comes the second blow at Concord. By breakfast time, the British were in Concord, searching for gunpowder and weapons. However, the colonists had hidden them, and in frustration, the soldiers piled up gun carriages and set them on fire. Okay, the British expected the Americans were going to break and run, but to their surprise, the Minutemen stood their ground and fired back. Soon, it was the Redcoats, or the British, who were running away in a panic.
And as they were running away and back to Boston, the Minutemen were lined up on the road just shooting. and as these British soldiers
are retreating.
were retreating. Okay, we're going to talk next about our kind of a lesson summary, if you will. This was a lot of information in this lesson. And if you want to look at the lesson summary, you can find it on page 101. In this lesson, you guys learned about the tensions between the colonies in Great Britain in the mid 1700s. Before 1763, okay, that was our first section. During the French and Indian War, 1754 to 1763, Great Britain and France fought for territory and power in North America. When the war ended, France gave up Canada to Great Britain, which now had a much larger American empire to control.
The next area had to do with early British actions in the colonies. The French and Indian War left Great Britain with huge debts, and they needed to pay for things somehow. To raise money, Parliament decided to pass along the war cost to the Americans. To do this, Parliament passed the Stamp Act in 1765. Colonists protested the Stamp Act because it was passed without colonial representation. Colonists also protested the Quartering Act, which required them to house British troops at the colony's expense.
Okay, the next section was the Townshend Acts and the Boston Massacre. The Townshend Acts imposed more taxes on the colonies, which divided many colonists into opposing camps. Loyalists urged obedience to Great Britain, but patriots resisted taxation without representation through protests, boycotts, and riots. Tensions in Boston erupted in violence in 1770 when British troops fired into a crowd of colonists in what became known as the Boston Massacre.
The Boston Tea Party and the Intolerable Acts. When patriots protested a new tax on tea by throwing tea into Boston Harbor in 1773, Great Britain responded by passing the Intolerable Acts to force the colonies to give in to British authority. Patriots responded by forming the First Continental Congress and organizing colonial militias.
And that takes us to Lexington and Concord. Fighting between patriots and British troops at Lexington and Concord in 1775 showed that colonists would not only fight for their rights, but were willing to die for them.
All right.
Okay, and that's the end of our podcast for this lesson. Thanks for listening.
All right, guys, get ready for that podcast quiz.